Minds. So this week we're going to be looking further into Gallipoli and the Western Front. So in an attempt to break the stalemate that had developed on the Western Front, Winston Churchill, who was in charge of the Royal Navy, argued for an attack on Turkey. Turkey was a part of the Ottoman Empire and an ally of Germany. The Gallipoli Campaign, as it became known, was the first major battle of World War I for Australian troops. It took place on the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey. Although many Australian men who enlisted in the early months of the war believed that they'll be travelling to Europe to fight against the Germans, many were instead sent to fight against the Turks. And a lot of Australians were actually quite upset about this because they had been promised that they'd be fighting the Germans. They were never actually told, all right, you're going to be fighting, the Turks. And it actually became quite a bit of a sore point. The formation of the ANZACs. When the war began in 1914, there was an enthusiastic response from people in Australia and New Zealand. Initially, the two military forces of Australia and New Zealand were separate. The Australian troops formed the 1st Australian Imperial Force, so the AIF, and the New Zealanders formed the 1st New Zealand Expeditionary Force. Early in 1915, as the two forces were training in Egypt, General Birdwood, commander of the Australian and New Zealand forces, decided to combine both forces to form a single corps, and the title Australia and New Zealand Army Corps, or ANZAC, was adopted. It was under this banner that the soldiers of both countries fought at Gallipoli and throughout the World War I. So the Gallipoli Campaign. So the Gallipoli Campaign was launched because Britain and France needed to move troops, equipment and weapons to Allied troops in Russia. In order to do this, they needed to travel across the Mediterranean Sea, pass through Turkish waters and cross over the Black Sea into Russia. As a result, the plan required Turkey, as part of the Ottoman Empire and an ally of Germany, to be forced out of the war. So let's just have a look at that. So as we go through here, right, so what they needed to do was get supplies into this section here, right, so they could fight along this front. But to do that, they'd have to come through the Mediterranean Sea and up this point here. And that's what they really needed to open up, because if they couldn't get supplies to the Russian Empire, there was no way that Russia could stay in the war. Alright, so this is just a little bit closer, and you can notice that this is Anzac Cove, where we weren't supposed to land, but we'll get to that in a sec. Alright, so this is where the British landed. This is where they first decided they were going to go through, but all of these areas were mined, and they just couldn't get through, and they wanted to get up here. It just was their first idea. It didn't happen though. Alright. So the first part of the campaign plan was launched on March 1915. This involved a naval attack through the Dardanelles, so up through here. A sea passage from the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea, so all the way down here. This action failed because the entrance to the Dardanelles had been laid with underwater mines. 3 Allied battleships were destroyed by these mines, and another 3 were badly damaged. They didn't know they were there, so it didn't work out well for them. And you notice there's the Dardanelles in between. Dardanelles is not here. This is the Gallipoli Peninsula. This stretch of water is the Dardanelles. Alright, so a plan was then developed to launch a land attack on the Gallipoli Peninsula from the Aegean Sea coast. The hope was the Allies would surprise the Turks, defeat them quickly, and then march on to take control of the Turkish capital, Constantinople. Always fun to say, by the way. Otherwise known as Istanbul. This would open up the desired supply lines through to Russia and help the Allies fight Germany and Austria from the east. On the 25th of April 1915, ground troops from Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand, India and the British Dominion of Newfoundland, now part of Canada, landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The campaign was in trouble from the beginning. As the Australian and New Zealand troops landed at what is now known Anzac Cove, they faced cliffs of up to 100 metres high and heavy gunfire from behind the Turkish fortifications. Those soldiers who made it to the beach were unprotected as they faced the Turkish guns. The ANZACs managed to secure the beach and made limited progress up the cliffs and inland, and this was for a majority of the time during the Gallipoli Campaign. So although the plan had been to take 7 kilometres of territory, the day ended with barely a single kilometre achieved. So they had planned to get 7 k's in on the first day, and it didn't happen. They were literally, because of where they landed, they were literally facing a cliff. There was no way they were going to get 7 kilometres done. So more than 600 Australian soldiers were killed on the first day of the campaign. On hearing news of the disastrous landing, the British commander of the campaign, General Sir Ian Hamilton, ordered the troops to dig until you were safe. So in other words, he was telling them to pretty much dig trenches along the cliff face. It wasn't a smart idea, but still. In August 1915, the Australians and New Zealanders launched 2 famous diversionary attacks, the Battle of the Lone Pine and the Battle of the Neck. The Australians captured Lone Pine in fighting so fierce that 7 Victoria Crosses were awarded to their men, and they just kept hammering them and just kept going and kept going. At the Neck, a charge by the Australian troops cost the lives of 234 in an area about the size of 3 tennis courts. Despite these battles, the situation on Gallipoli remained largely unchanged for the 8 months of the campaign. Now, the Battle of the Neck is the one that's the final scene in Gallipoli. I have put that particular sequence into this video. However, be aware it does show people dying rather graphically. So it is all fake. It is from the movie. But be aware that it is there. You may want to fast forward that if you don't want to see it. Alright, so this is pretty much what it looks like. And this is Gallipoli, this is Anzac Cove. I've been there. It's now more of like a tourist spot. But if you happen to look, these are the cliff faces. You're never going to make 7 k's into that. And they had, the Turks had the fortifications up the top. You were never going to make it to the top. So the conditions at Gallipoli, I'm going to let you read that by yourself, but the conditions at Gallipoli were extremely difficult for the ANZACs. As the Turks held the high ground, the ANZACs were always exposed to enemy fire. Nowhere was safe. They were in a constant danger day and night from snipers or expert shots or artillery bombardment from the Turkish guns. The Allies landed in the Turkish spring and a sweltering summer followed. When winter arrived, the bitter cold and snow took its toll on the troops. You've got to remember that Australians weren't used to that kind of cold weather. They just weren't used to it. So they only prepared for, summer and, what we would expect to be a winter, which isn't very much. So we weren't prepared for this particular sort of campaign. So despite the rain and the snow, drinking water was in short supply. They couldn't actually get to a lake or a river or something like that, and you can't drink seawater. So it had to be shipped into the troops, and this could be difficult if a supply ship ran into problems. Water was rationed carefully, and soldiers were so conscious of the shortages that they often shaved with leftover cold tea. Food was more plentiful, although lacking in variety. Rations commonly included canned meat, corned beef, called bully beef, and hard biscuits. And I've actually included a recipe at the end of this PowerPoint for hardtack, which is something that the Australian troops used to eat. If you're close to corned beef or bully beef, you might be looking at things like Spam. You can even get corned beef in a can. I don't recommend you eat it, but, try anything once. Alright, so more Australians and New Zealanders died or were forced into hospital as a result of disease rather than enemy action, right? The conditions were terrible at Gallipoli. So painful conditions and diseases such as trench foot, dysentery, diarrhea, gastroenteritis were common in the damp conditions of the trenches. Like in the Western Front, the trenches filled up with water and you were stuck there. You couldn't move. If you moved, you died. So illness was also spread by rats, lice, flies and mosquitoes. Many pests were attracted by the strong odour of decomposing bodies and human waste. Poor sanitation and poor handling practices meant that the germs were often transferred to food and water supplies. We have it pretty good right now. We get to isolate at home. So in December 1915, because remember we landed on the 25th of April 1915. In December 1915, the ANZACs were finally ordered to withdraw from Gallipoli. There was no way we were going to win. We barely got past, a couple of kilometres. There was no way. To hide the fact that they were leaving, they rigged up some rifles to fire at random. And this was an Australian thing, by the way. They did this by attaching tins to the rifles, trigger mechanisms with string. When the tins filled with water dripping from the other tins suspended above, so you can see in the picture there, their weight caused the triggers to be pulled and the rifles to fire. This tactic became known as the ghost guns of Gallipoli. And the reason why that is because the water used to drip randomly. They'd have bigger holes and smaller holes from the top to the bottom, and it would just pull the triggers randomly. So they were the ghost guns. No one was actually there to fire them. The soldiers also carefully wrapped horses' hooves in cloth to muffle the sound of their leaving. The last Australian soldiers were evacuated overnight on the 19th to the 20th of December. Because of its efficiency, the silent withdrawal is usually remembered as the most successful part of the Gallipoli campaign. How sad is that? So over the course of the campaign, 8,709 Australians died and 19,000 were wounded. Over the same time period, over 80,000 Turks were killed. So we didn't win the battle, but we lost less men than what the Turks did, which is interesting. So during their time on Gallipoli, the diggers, as Australian troops became known, displayed a courage and ingenuity that would form the basis of the ANZAC legend. This legend would contribute to the Australian sense of identity over the course of the 20th century.
We are on the battlefield, well under the fire of the enemy.
This was the first casualty, and very soon there were several others hit.
Then the order was given to fix bayonets and drive the Turks out, which we did with a vengeance.
This was the landing at Gallipoli on April 25th, 1915, as described by some of the men that lived through it. More than 50,000 Australian troops fought here, and 8,000 of them died here too. But Gallipoli was just one small part of a much bigger conflict. What's now known as the First World War began in 1914 between these two powerful groups. Australia was still a member of the British Empire, and many young Aussies saw it as a chance to sign up and serve their country.
I was keen, 100% keen, like we all were in those days.
By November 1914, a force of 20,000 Australian men had arrived in Egypt, ready to fight. Most of the fighting was taking place here, on the Western Front in France. But months in, neither side was winning. So Britain came up with a plan to defeat Germany by attacking its allies, Austria, Hungary, and what's now Turkey. Their goal was to take control of this area, called the Dardanelles. Ground forces were sent in at 3 main points. Many were actually British and French. Australians and New Zealanders made up just one of the landings, at a place we now know as Anzac Cove.
When she hit the beach, I gave the word to get out, and out the men got at once, into the water, up to their necks.
In darkness, they faced a tough and difficult climb up the beach, while from above, Turkish soldiers and artillery fired on them. Both sides dug trenches for cover.
The place was a quarter in the bursting shells, you know.
For months, the fighting continued, neither side getting an advantage over the other, though several attempts were made. One of those was the Battle of Lone Pine. The Aussies created a diversion by attacking Turkey's front lines, then held their position despite intense fighting. 7 Australians won the Victoria Cross here, the highest award for bravery in wartime. But while the Australian attack was successful, the overall Allied mission failed. By December, the Allies gave up on taking Gallipoli and started planning an evacuation instead. To help, one Aussie soldier came up with this invention, a gun that would go off on its own using weighted cans of water. The drip rifle helped hold off any attacks, while the ANZACs withdrew.
We thought we'd be very lucky if we got away.
But they did. And after 8 long months, the Gallipoli Campaign was finally over. World War I stretched on for another 3 years. And during that time, on the Western Front, the ANZACs would fight many more battles and lose many more lives than they did at Gallipoli. But they'd also have a much bigger impact, which eventually helped the Allies go on to win the war in 1918. Gallipoli wasn't the most important battle Australia was involved in during World War I, but it's still remembered as the first real battle we took part in as a nation. And every year since, on April 25th, people around the country commemorate those who fought and died there. Something still just as important 100 years on.
Alright, so at the start of the war in August 1914, we didn't start off with Gallipoli. That's where Australia first started. However, the war itself started on the Western Front. So when the Germans had marched through Belgium and into France through the Schlieffen Plan. So there was fierce resistance from the British and the French that stopped them from moving further into France. However, the Allies were unable to drive the Germans back, and by Christmas 1914 there was a deadlock. The Germans and the Allies faced each other across a line of trenches that stretched from Ostend on the Belgian coast to in a southerly direction, into a southeasterly direction to the Swiss border. So if we happen to look down here, there's Ostend there on the Belgian border, in a southeasterly direction to the Swiss border, so down that green line there to Switzerland, which is down here. Many historians see the Western Front as the defining experience of World War I. New weapons such as gas tanks were introduced here, and that's what you learnt last week. Defensive tactics using machine guns, trenches, barbed wire and artillery meant that rather than a rapid war of movement like most of the wars had been in previous years, on the Western Front it became bogged down in a senseless series of attacks and counterattacks, each achieving little but costing millions of lives. So, breaking the stalemate. Between 1915 and 1918, there were many attempts to break the stalemate of trench conflict because trench warfare was useless in regards to making any grounds. Initially, there'd be a long and sustained artillery attack, so they would bomb the trenches as much as they could using artillery, and they would be bombarded with explosive shells, and they pretty much did it so the defending troops would go underground and it would destroy their fortifications and clear the troops for the opposing force to cross no man's land. However, those men were actually weighed down with heavy equipment, and soldiers would cross the strip of territory into the opponent's trenches. That was the theory. They would struggle through mud-filled shell holes, and remember, they were carrying very heavy equipment, and they might learn that the bombardment had not destroyed the barbed wire obstacle, so they had to go over the top of the barbed wire through various spikes anything that was put in their path, and usually created by their own bombing. More frightening still was the possibility that the artillery attack had failed to destroy the enemy's position. Most of the time, they would move back trenches. So as soon as they saw something, the artillery coming, the opposing force used to actually, move back a couple of trenches, because it wasn't just one trench, it'd be 3 or 4 of them, and they'd move back when the fighting was when the bombardment occurred, and then they would just go and, return when the shelling had stopped. So they thought that, it had hit them. However, the enemy would just emerge from the deep bunkers to fire on them with machine guns as they attempted to get across no man's land, which was really hard with their heavy equipment, with the barbed wire, everything. So generally such assaults on the enemy trenches failed to achieve their goals. Confusion, smoke, noise and death turned plans into chaos. If attackers reached enemy lines, hand-to-hand or one-on-one combat with rifles, bayonets, pistols and grenades often followed, usually to a poor success rate. If let's just say for example 100 men happen to cross no man's land into an enemy's trench, most of those men would not make it. So you might get there with about 10. But you've still got to face the enemy in their own trenches. There's a good chance you weren't going to survive that hand-to-hand battle. So if ground was gained, it could be retaken in a counter-offensive only weeks later. So what used to happen was, let's say for example the French took the German trenches. What would happen is the Germans would pull back further, and they'd dig another trench. And then what would happen is the Germans would then take back their original trench, and the French would have to go back to their original. And it was a whole bunch of back and forth, and no one ever made any ground. It was not a successful battle tactic. The only real consequence of most battles that took place on the Western Front over the 4 years was death and injury, and there was a lot. You may want to look at some of the injuries from fighting in the trenches. One very gross one, and I promise I have not put a video in here about it, but trench foot. Have a look at it. It is gross. So you can imagine people trying to get over the top of trenches in this kind of circumstance. It's not nice. Alright, so, and not all trenches are the square ones that you see in, in the movies. Sometimes they were only, a metre tall, if that, and you just had to hope that you were short enough to get through. Yep, so it was muddy, no man's land was like that. So, one of the deadliest battles in World War I history was the Somme. So the First Battle of the Somme, in an area along the banks of the Somme River, was one of the most costly attempts to break the stalemate of the trenches. Between July and November 1916, the Allied forces tried to break through German lines. Focused on a 19-kilometre front in the northern France, the soldiers managed to push the Germans back by about 8k. These gains came at an enormous price. The initial softening up bombardment used over 1.5 million shells in a week-long attack. British deaths on the first day of the assault were estimated over 19,000, so that was only on one day. 35,000 were injured on that first day, and 2,000 were counted as missing. Yeah, pretty much they could be counted towards the deaths. The French casualties for the first day alone were around 7,000. Later in the Somme campaign, Australian and New Zealand troops fought at Pozieres from the 23rd of July to the 8th of August. Hey, that's today. Oh, it's not today. After making early gains, Australia suffered over 23,000 casualties. By the end of the Somme campaign, casualty figures for the Allies were around 620,000 dead and wounded, and 500,000 for the Germans. So it was a pointless campaign, right? That's only a couple of months, between July and November. 620,000 dead and wounded. And then 500,000 for the Germans. We mustn't forget the Germans. So it's not, I wouldn't say it was successful. It was considered the deadliest battle. Alright, and this is the battle of the Somme, or this is the map of it, and you can see where it's got little dates on it and where certain things would be. On this side you have the Germans, and then you have this side which is the French and the English, the British, and yeah, see all those dotted lines there? These are the trenches that would be fought and gained. So at one point the war was there at once, and that's in November, that's where it finished up. So between July and November, that's as far as they got. That's it. Alright, then we have another battle here. So another trench line here at 15th of September, 14th of July there, and the 1st of July was there. Alright, so between there, July 1st and in November, that's all they achieved. That's very, very sad. Alrighty.
Battle of the Somme. The first day of the Somme, 1st of July 1916. In 1915, Britain was unable to launch any major attacks, but that was all about to change. The British volunteers who made up the new armies were eager to go to battle. The aim of the offensive was to attack in Picardy north of the River Somme, break through the German line, exploiting the gap with cavalry. This was to be a joint Anglo-French effort. However, many troops from the French army had to be withdrawn to reinforce Verdun. General Douglas Haig's plan would use 750,000 men against the German front line. General Henry Rawlinson would lead the main attack with the 4th Army, while General Edmund Allenby and the 3rd Army would lead supporting operations. Morale was high amongst the British, and especially with the new army recruits. After an 8-day British bombardment, which Haig thought would destroy the German forward defences, the attack began. British soldiers moved across no man's land on the 1st of July at 7:30 in the morning. They were soon hit by machine guns and explosive shells as they progressed towards the German line. The advance was then halted because of barbed wire and heavily defended trenches. General Falloux and the French 6th Army did well in the south, but the British Army suffered appalling heavy losses. They had suffered 58,000 casualties, with a third of them killed. The battle had failed for a number of reasons on that day. The bombardment was inadequate because of the lack of artillery and weakness of their shells in destroying barbed wire and caving in the enemy trenches. The delay between the barrage and the attack gave the Germans time to recover to their positions and man them. Haig did not prepare an alternative plan for July the 1st because he did not have faith in the new troops to cope with anything but the step-by-step approach drummed into them pre-battle. The state of communications also meant that any intel he received from the front line would be outdated by the time it reached him. The first day of the Somme has been called the worst day in the history of the British Army.
Watch our other videos to learn more. Get your copy of
So we've heard about the about the British and the French on the Western Front. However, the Australians also fought there as well. So Australians were fighting on the Western Front between 1916 and 1918, and were engaged in numerous battles that earned more than 50 Victorian Crosses for the soldiers who participated. Two of the most destructive battles involving Australians were at Fromelles in northern France in 1916 and Bullecourt closer to Paris in 1917. At Fromelles, an attack on the German trenches was designed to draw German attention away from the onslaught of German lines 80 kilometres to the south on the banks of the Somme River. The attack was unsuccessful and the cost was terrible. In one day, 1,917 Australian soldiers were killed and over 3,600 were injured, some to later die of their injury. This event has been described as the worst 24 hours in Australia's entire history. So this was in conjunction with the battles at the Somme. So it wasn't just men who enlisted in war, women also attempted to as well, but were usually told that war was no place for the ladies, and the only place that they could actually serve is if they were nurses. So the nurses worked under appalling conditions, especially on the Western Front, where they made makeshift hospitals in the trenches behind the lines, and they got they became known as the Roses of No Man's Land. Over the course of World War I, 2,562 Australian nurses joined the AIF as members of medical units. Out of this number, 2,139 served overseas in the Middle East and on the Western Front. 25 women lost their lives while serving overseas, and 388 received military honours. And you may want to read Source 5, so you may want to pause it there. So, the trenches. So the trenches were approximately 700 kilometres long, and they stretched along the coast of Belgium to the border of Switzerland, and there were 4 different types of trenches. The front-line trench was usually about a kilometre from the Germans' front trench, and behind this was the support trench, which had the men and supplies to assist those on the front line, and then there was the reserve trench, which had emergency supplies, and then there was the communication trenches, which sort of linked them all together. So if you can look in the pictures, you saw down here we had, bunkers, and a lot of people used to actually hide in those. We had the field hospital, so we're talking about the nurses in the front. A lot of the trenches, they weren't a straight line, they're always zigzagged. So in that way, if someone did happen to get into your trench, you could hide behind one of those points, and you could, shoot them or whatever. You wouldn't, if you had a straight line, they had a straight line to shooting you, so it wasn't good. They had early aircraft. If there was more aircraft during this time, trench warfare would have been relatively quickly done. Tanks went through no man's land, usually got stuck. There was observation balloons, however, these were usually shot down. Behind the trenches, they had the artillery. No man's land had barbed wire, and it wasn't particularly pleasant. You used to have, various spots, and you can see how these men are standing up here. That was the trench board, and you'd have like a sump down the bottom, and that was to collect the water and hopefully not stand in it. Unfortunately, most of the time, you were standing in the water. So the weekly task this week is it's another online worksheet like you did in week 2, and you just have to click that link. I'll put it in the weekly plan, of course. You complete the online worksheet. Please make sure you use your full name. That'd be greatly appreciated. Don't use fake names because that's pointless to me. And then I start sending home emails to your parents because you haven't done it, because you haven't used your real name. It is due in on the 14th of August. So the extension activity, you may want to do a trench warfare collage. So you include 5 pictures of trench warfare. Include more. You'll need more. 5 words describing conditions of the trenches, and at least 2 quotes from someone who lived in the trenches during World War I. Try to make them really, really creative. Make sure you stick to World War I, so be very specific in your searches. Enrichment activity, there's some videos here on the trenches. Creative task, you've got the hardtack cookies, and these were or biscuits. They're what used to be eaten by the soldiers in Gallipoli. They are very hard, and that's why they're called hardtack. They were made by Arnott's. They lasted forever, but they were problematic. And feel free to use. Go crazy. I'd love to see if you actually tried them and made them. If you don't want to make them, make some ANZAC cookies. Come on, people. Use your time wisely. Some references. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Have a good week.